long days and pleasant nights. I am he known as King Crusoe, but you can call me KC. In today's video, we are starting off the Stephen King tier list series for my channel, but just fair warning, right at the beginning of this is not going to be a super regular series in that it's going to take a long time in between videos. I have episode 1 here prepared for you now, starting off with The Dark Tower, which was amongst the first Stephen King that I read, and then I should have a part 2 covering the first couple handfuls of his other main novels that I've read, over the last couple years, at some point in the not too horribly distant future. But keep in mind, I still have a few of those books for part 2 left to read, and then it's going to take me many years to actually get through the amount of books necessary to do more of these tier list videos in the future. So if you're clicking on this expecting for this to be multiple weeks of doing several parts of this, it's not going to be that. Don't get your hopes up for it, and please don't comment asking for more Stephen King tier lists sooner than I am ready to do so. I have reviews for all the Stephen King books that I have read up on the channel. At the time that this video is coming out, I'm probably right in the middle of the next Stephen King book that I'm actively reading. I'm recording this a little bit early, so The Dead Zone is the one that I'm probably reading right now, and then I have 2 more after this that I'm going to read before I record part 2. And then you can follow along on the channel with anything else that I choose to read of his in the future. I'm going to try to make them fairly regular reads so that I can do these, somewhat often, but by somewhat often, I mean it'll probably still be at least 1 to 2 years in between each one of these tier list videos, just on account of how slow I read, how often, or rather how not often, I'm going to be able to read Stephen King books within, the limited number of books that I can read in a year, and just because of other production related stuff. Anyway, that's enough preamble for this series. Let's begin the tier list of The Dark Tower within Stephen King's bibliography. Now, there's 7 books in here, but one of these books I read twice because I read The Gunslinger obviously first, and then also reread it at the end. And yes, I read The Wind Through the Keyhole in between Wizard and Glass and Wolves of the Kala. If you want to know how I feel more specifically on each one of these books, I mentioned I have already reviewed all of these books. In fact, those reviews were early enough on the channel that they still have no views on them in many cases, and definitely no watch hours on them at this point. So if you want to check out that stuff, I probably recommend that you do so. In fact, I even have 2 reviews of The Gunslinger from the first time I read it versus the reread, because it was a very different experience both times. I also have a ranking of the series that I did when I was pretty clean off of the series. At this point, it's been a couple years removed from it, so, some things may vary from my thoughts on them previously as time has gone on. Before we actually get into the tier list portion of this itself, let's obviously take a look at the tiers themselves. That was a very poorly structured sentence. I apologize. The top of the tower is obviously the cream of the crop, essentially the best of the best amongst King's bibliography. It's Got the Shine is the good books that don't quite make it up into that top tier, but definitely are not anything that I would consider middling or average or having enough problems to really bring it down. Average is just average. It means it's middle of the road, or it's got a pretty fine balance of things that are good versus things that are bad, or it's overall just kind of forgettable. It's going to be kind of a more variable list. I would presume that It's Got the Shine and Average are going to contain the most books in here, but we'll end up seeing what happens. This second from the bottom tier is God is Cruel, Sometimes He Makes You Live, in that it's not a great book. I probably disliked it more than I liked it. That's where that's going to go. And then, seriously, What in the World Did I Just Read is essentially exactly what that label says. It's an actively terrible book. So I can't imagine that there's going to be a ton of stuff in either of these 2 tiers, because I tend to rate stuff pretty positively. But I'm going to try to average out my ratings a little bit more relative to Stephen King specifically, rather than all of the things that I've read. Because if I did that, basically everything would be 4 or 5 star, ending up in here. So I'm going to try to shift the standard distribution, shift that bell curve a little bit to make this a bit better. With that being said, now let's talk about the actual books. On my first read, The Gunslinger, the first book in the series, came off as pretty average. I enjoyed it overall. In fact, I think I enjoyed it more than I didn't, but a lot of stuff definitely flew over my head. If you read The Gunslinger as a first-time reader, you know exactly what I mean. There's a lot of question marks to be had here, a lot of stuff that is like, I don't even know really what's going on, but it was enjoyable. I enjoyed it a lot, and I didn't really understand why it has a somewhat negative reputation. That's kind of where things fell for me, but I still enjoyed the book quite a bit for what it was. So that is where it's going to go as of the first time read. The Drawing of the Three, Book 2, is a little bit harder to place, but I'm ultimately going to put it in It's Got the Shine, even though there is a section of it that I distinctly dislike. The Detta and Odetta stuff I didn't really enjoy about this. In fact, Susanna's character as a whole is not great throughout the whole entire series. Definitely the most boring and or the most unlikable character within the series, in my opinion. At least of the main cast, definitely my least favorite. So I struggled with some of those sections, and it kind of made it a struggle to really love this book despite the fantastic stuff that it does. There are great moments, great climax. Eddie's section in particular is chef's kiss, but there are some moments in this that definitely drug it down a little bit for me during my initial reading experience. Next up, we're going to talk about The Wastelands, in which it's kind of the same deal. It's hard to really distinguish whether this is average or It's Got the Shine. I'm going to say It's Got the Shine, and I'm going to say it's above The Drawing of the Three. And the reason why I kind of struggle with the placement with The Wastelands, this is another hot take because these are like the two most popular books in the series, it is because The Wastelands, well, it doesn't really have a full ending. It doesn't have a climax. Well, it has a climax, but it only has like half of a climax. And as a person who really likes the climax and resolution of books, it's generally my favorite portions of books. It's generally my favorite portions of series as well, as you'll come to see a little bit later in this video. The Wastelands ends right in the middle of the climax, and that just kind of irritates me from a structural perspective. And also the second half just in general wasn't quite my thing. I didn't love the Lud stuff the way that it seems like everybody else does. So, you know, it didn't really connect with me. I think, you know, the iconic imagery of the train, Blaine the train in this book is kind of funny considering that he basically doesn't exist in the book. It being called The Wastelands is funny because it also basically doesn't exist in the book. It's like the last like 100 pages out of 600, mind you, that either of these things are even a thought of the book. So that's kind of funny. But the first half of it was incredible. I still remember plowing through those first 300 pages and just being blown away by it. So The Wastelands is a definite It's Got the Shine moment, but you know, not necessarily top tier. These two books are, neither of them are my favorite Stephen King books, and neither of them are my favorite Dark Tower books. Wizard and Glass, however, is a really tough one to place because it's like top of the tower, dude. It is so close to top of the tower that like it might as well be. I'm actually going to resize this just a little bit so I can actually see everything going on. It's basically top of the tower. I'm going to go ahead and keep it here because parts 2 and 3 of Wizard and Glass are like one of the most perfect things I've ever read. In fact, I actually got a really strong hankering pretty recently to pick up Wizard and Glass just to read parts 2 and 3. The flashback sequence for Roland in this book is phenomenal. I don't love that part 1 of it is just the end of The Wastelands. I would have preferred for that to be structured better and more appropriately. Part 4 of it, I also take it or leave it. Didn't really care one way or the other for it because coming off of the highs that part 2 and 3 embark or, you know, give me, not least because at the time it like really reminded me of some personal experiences that just hit hard, super hard emotionally, were really effectively well done. Coming off of parts 2 and 3, 4 kind of struggles. But those parts 2 and 3 are so perfect that like Wizard and Glass can't go anywhere besides the top of the tower, even though by all means it should be lower because I don't really care for parts 1 or 4 very much. The Wind Through the Keyhole is an average book, I'll say, in the Stephen King bibliography. It's definitely overhated and probably underrated. Those are two different things, mind you. If you want to know my rants about people calling things underrated and meaning something different. I have a video on that, but that is not the discussion of today's video. Wind Through the Keyhole, I would actually say I would have ranked above my first reading of The Gunslinger. You know, it's good. It is really good. It's hard to read after Wizard and Glass insofar as it's more flashback stuff, and it also has a portion in which it's not just flashback, it's also got a story within that flashback, thus making it the triple layer story within a story within a story, rather than Wizard and Glass being largely story within a story. And that could be a little bit tedious to deal with, but I enjoyed the thematic stuff. I enjoyed the ties to the world that the Wind Through the Keyhole featured. I enjoyed the story itself. I found it really, really good. It kind of fits somewhat haphazardly within the series, so I can understand why somebody doesn't really like it in its placement, especially since it does follow a big old flashback in Wizard and Glass, so it's kind of doubling down on some of the side questiness. But I really enjoyed it, and in fact, I'm glad that I read it in between books 4 and 5. I would have a harder time reading Wind Through the Keyhole after the series than in the middle of it. So I would still recommend reading it in the middle of the series, or just straight up skipping it. I wouldn't recommend reading it afterwards unless you're like several years removed from the series or something like that, or at least a couple years removed, we'll say. Yeah, that's what I'll say about Wind Through the Keyhole. I think it is the hate on it is overplayed. It's not a bad book by any means, but it's also not particularly standout either. Wolves of the Kala is a great book. It's definitely top of It's Got the Shine for this portion of this of the tier list, and definitely for Stephen King as a whole at this point in time, because it's good. It's really good. It's great. I loved Wolves of the Kala. I think it is also a little bit underrated on account of the fact that after Wizard and Glass, people wanted a little bit more forward progression. And like Wolves of the Kala is only forward progression in an indirect manner, so it doesn't really feel like forward progression. So I can understand why people have complaints about it. In fact, like the whole like middle act of it, I believe this thing's split into 3 parts. It might be split into more parts. I forget off the top of my head. But like, let's say the second act of Wolves of the Kala is a little bit side questy. It is a little bit fetch questy in ways. There are portions of it that I feel like were a little bit too long. One particular character's story, recounting of his own story, I'm not going to say the name for want of spoilers. That particular character's backstory takes a little bit more time than I feel like it needed or justified. I think that could have been cut a little bit, but basically everything I enjoyed about it, I blasted through Wolves of the Kala in just a couple weeks, maybe even like just a week and a half. And for the time that I was reading this series, that was incredible timing. I really enjoyed it. Wolves of the Kala was great. Definitely underrated in my opinion, especially in context of The Dark Tower as a series. There are some other people who really like Wolves of the Kala like me, but as far as like, you know, Drawing of the Three and The Wastelands, I think it's better than both of those books, actually. Yeah, the unpopular opinion, I know, but that's how things go. Song of Susanna, I'm going to put in God is Cruel, Sometimes He Makes You Live, and that is because it's just fine. Like, it is a thoroughly fine book, and that is about it. It does not have a climax at all, where my primary complaint with The Wastelands is that it cuts off halfway through the climax, and that's a problem with, like, me, the way that I enjoy stories. There's no reason why King should have done that. King's habit of not outlining ends up, you know, being his own demise sometimes as far as, like, climaxes and endings and stuff are concerned. I think the hate on King endings overall is a little bit overplayed, but you know, in this way, it's definitely apparent that some of these things can have problems when you don't outline your story, when you don't really plan ahead of time. Song of Susanna was a kind of problem with this, which is really funny because he wrote Wolves of the Kala, Song of Susanna, and The Dark Tower all basically at the same time, and they all published very quickly, one after another, and I think Song of Susanna and Dark Tower specifically were only a few months apart. Song of Susanna is the shortest book in the series, not counting the first one and then the little mini story here. And it's significantly shorter than like Wolves or Wizard, and way shorter than The Dark Tower, because The Dark Tower is the longest book in the series. Song of Susanna's climax is in the next book for no other reason than because of arbitrary splitting. And like, any editor should have pointed at that split and been like, King, this is stupid. Just put part 1 of The Dark Tower and Song of Susanna, then you have a complete book here. And the longest book in the series is no longer the longest book in the series. From every metric, it would have made sense to split it differently. So I have a problem with the fact that Song of Susanna doesn't have a climax, and I have a bigger problem with it not having a climax because it's pretty boring. I admit part of my experience with this is probably tainted by the fact that I was in a little bit of a reading slump at the time that I read Song of Susanna, induced partially by Song of Susanna being a little bit boring, but also because I had either just gotten or just recovered from having the virus that shall not be named, as Mike's Book Reviews puts it. At the time, it was the most sick I've been in many, many years, and I haven't basically been sick since then, which is funny enough. But I was in a reading slump at the time that I read Song of Susanna, and it was just boring. I struggled to read. I gamed and did basically nothing else for an entire 2 or 3 weeks, where I just couldn't really pick up Song of Susanna and get the motivation to actually read it. And when I did finally finish it, I was obviously very unenthused by the lack of ending and the lack of climax, and I struggle with that. The fact that it is about who I previously said is the most boring character in the series. I don't really like Susanna very much. The fact that it is mostly focused on her, I don't like. The only thing about Song of Susanna that I actively really enjoyed was the Eddie and Roland plotline. The other stuff I could hardly have cared less about, especially since they were not resolved in this book and were not resolved until the next book. So Song of Susanna is just not good. It's not terrible, but it's just, it's not my thing. I think it has major problems. But we're going to come up into The Dark Tower, which is, I have a lot of hot takes in this video, but The Dark Tower being my favorite book in the series and one of my 2 favorites, definitely top 3 favorite Stephen King books entirely, is definitely a hot take. A lot of people have a lot of problems with The Dark Tower, and I understand why. It totally makes sense, don't get me wrong. But I loved it. I loved everything about it. Even the things that I can look at and say, I understand why people have problems with that. I understand why people have problems with the way that one particular character was handled, and the way that one other character basically served no purpose at the end of the day, despite being built up like he was supposed to be something special. I understand why people had problems with the way the main antagonist was handled, even though the way he was handled was heavily foreshadowed, at least since Wolves of the Kala, totally made sense to me, although I understand why people would be disappointed. I understand why that climax in general would be kind of a little bit weird, but every step of the journey of the Dark Tower I was moved by to one degree or another. Characters facing certain fates, the climax and the resolution, the coda in which the actual Dark Tower is climbed. Spoilers, I guess, but what else are you expecting for the end of the Dark Tower, in which the entire journey is to get to the Dark Tower? That's the whole point of the series. The actual coda in which the story is wrapped up it couldn't have been done any other way, and I loved that decision that was made there. One of the few moments where King not really planning out what it meant ahead of time probably was okay, because he got to that and was straight up started off the coda as a meta, author saying this isn't going to be for everybody, but this is the only way that it could have been. And then the rest of the coda actually tells that. It's great. The epilogue is great. Every step of this journey was great. And like I've said, this is the longest book in the series. It's about 250,000 words, so it's not necessarily that long in the grand scheme of things. If you read epic fantasy, for example, Wheel of Time, which is ironically sitting right behind Dark Tower on the shelf right there, let's say probably at least 2/3 of Wheel of Time is longer than the Dark Tower is. By the Dark Tower, I obviously mean the 7th book in the series here. So it's not like it's that long, and King's prose isn't necessarily that difficult or that arduous to read, but I blew through the Dark Tower. When I said that I read Wolves of the Kala really quickly, I meant that, but I read all of the Dark Tower, all 250,000 words of that thing, in 1 week, 7 days. For somebody with my reading pace, that is absurd. I spent so many hours every day that week just reading this book. it was incredible. I loved it. I understand why people aren't going to like that take of it being at this point my favorite Stephen King book. But, well, it's not my favorite Stephen King book, actually. That's a lie. You'll see in part 2 what is currently actively my favorite Stephen King book. But my favorite book in the Dark Tower is the title book, and there's no other answer there. Wizard and Glass is really great because of parts 2 and 3, but those parts 1 and 4, me not really caring about them, definitely bring them down from the Dark Tower. Even though I would say parts 2 and 3 of Wizard and Glass are actually my favorite part of the Dark Tower, as an entire book, book 7 is easily the best one, and I adored it. I loved it. Gonna end the video here because, actually, no, I'm not, because I have one more book to talk about. This would be my ranking if I hadn't reread The Gunslinger. After rereading The Gunslinger, it goes up to It's Got the Shine. It actually puts things off balance a little bit because the amount of foreshadowing in the revised version of The Gunslinger, and to be fair, I read the revised version in both reads, but if you read The Gunslinger like pretty much immediately after reading The Dark Tower, I admit I was a little bit fatigued at that point after having spent 1 week reading all of that 7th book, and then I spent like the next 2 or 3 days just reading The Gunslinger again. I was a little bit tired, and so found it a little hard to actively want to read the book just because of that kind of fatigue. But if not for that fatigue, it was even more incredible the second time, and really made the whole journey worth it. Like, I do not think you have read The Dark Tower as a series until you have reread The Gunslinger after finishing the series, particularly the revised version, because the amount of hints and clues and references to literally every single other book of the series is just phenomenal. You're like, wait a minute, I know that name. I know what that means. I know the significance of this. I know all of this stuff, and I know why this makes sense after having finished the series. It is incredible. I'm going to balance out the 2 readings and put this at the top of average instead of having it in It's Got the Shine. But I seriously think that The Gunslinger is worth rereading after experiencing the series. Like, please do that. If you read through this whole series, it is worth it. It is seriously worth it. And I guarantee you'll enjoy The Gunslinger more the second time than you did the first time. I know I did, and I already enjoyed it the first time. But that is the actual end of this tier list. Thank you for watching part 1. I have no idea at this point in time when part 2 is going to come out. I would anticipate it could come out very late this year. It'll probably be pretty early, like maybe quarter 1 or quarter 2 of next year or something like that. It's probably the time frame that I'm looking at because, again, I have to finish The Dead Zone, which I'm reading now, and then I have to read Firestarter and Cujo, and I'm not 100% sure when those will be in the TBR. They're both in the TBR for the first half of 2025 at the moment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that will happen. If I can get that next tier list video out late this year, I will do that, and then I'll try to read enough Stephen King books over, like, I don't know, the end of 2025 and especially in 2026 to get another tier list out before, you know, like a year and a half after this second episode. But I have no idea if that's going to be possible or if I'm going to be able to do that. Even so, thank you for watching this video. As I said earlier, if you want to hear a little bit deeper thoughts on each of those books, I have all 8 reviews covering the 7 books, plus The Gunslinger a second time, and a spoiler-filled ranking. I should have specified that earlier. I have a series ranking that was spoiler-filled in which I talked about the books again in that kind of capacity, where I actually talk about the spoilers, so you kind of got basically my current ranking of the series through this tier list. But that ranking, I actually explain a little bit of why with the spoilers rather than trying to dodge around some of that stuff like I did in this video. But thank you for checking this out one final time. I really, really appreciate it. For now, I have been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video, whatever that may be.